These numbers have caused quite a bit of controversy over the years. How could the meat everyone's eating cause more greenhouse gas emissions than what's caused by powering all the cars, trucks, planes, and trains that we drive and fly every day? It's hardly conceivable, but instead of 18%, as that original 2006 United Nations report stated, or even their most recent figure of 14.5%, a couple of researchers found that livestock could produce, it's possible according to them, they could produce as much as 51% of all human-induced greenhouse gas emissions. Now, most scientific organizations are not on board with this figure yet, but it does bring up a number of questions, and there are a number of reasons for the differences between the numbers, low to high. Most important for me is the vast underreporting, the over-categorization, the use of inaccurate global warming potential for methane, which is actually 4 times higher than what the United Nations used, and potential bias amongst the authors of those United Nations reports, who are well-known consultants for the livestock industry. These lower figures are also without factoring in all the greenhouse gases emitted because of our demand to eat fish, the fuel, refrigeration, processing, packaging, transportation, etc. And regardless of where the exact number resides, somewhere between 14.5% and 51% or higher, it really doesn't matter, does it? Because it's too much. It's cause for alarm, and it's cause for immediate action. A perfect example of how this information is suppressed occurs every single year during our climate change conferences, pretty high profile, held originally in Kyoto with its 1997 Kyoto Protocol. Last year it was held in Paris. This year it's going to be held in Morocco, where countries come together, and at least superficially, they're trying to solve this global warming problem. But none of this is being addressed. None of it. During last year's conference, organizers knew that time is running out, though. So agreements were made called intended, nationally determined contributions, which sounds rather subjective, and they are. So by all estimates, these pledges are not going to be ambitious enough. Well, that's because the Kyoto Protocol runs out in just a couple years, in the year 2020. There's still no legally binding commitments, and climate scientists predict that warming will continue to reach a rise of nearly 3 degrees centigrade by the end of this century, 2 times higher than their goal, even with these intended nationally determined contributions. Well, every aspect of global depletion has a timeline. It's really not a question of if we're going to run out of something, it's when, at our current pace. One of the most critical timelines of all is that of climate change. We only have a 2-year window of time from now to drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or we're going to see irreversible warming of our planet with catastrophic effects. It's already happening today. And what exactly does drastically reduce mean? Well, drastically reduce means that we have to cut human-induced greenhouse gas emissions by half of what they are today, half in the next 2 years. How are we going to do that? And then we have to get to 0 net emissions by the year 2050. And yet, global emissions are accelerating, especially methane. And the largest single source of global methane is from raising livestock. Look, we have enough greenhouse gas problems from natural causes to deal with in the next few years, such as managing what's being released from the tundra as the Arctic permafrost continues to thaw. Why not make things easier on ourselves, and by doing something simple like cutting meat and dairy products from our diet, something we can easily do. It's certainly easier than going up and trying to tackle the tundra, isn't it? And if you do the math, it's conceivable that we could exceed our budget, what's allowed for atmospheric carbon, by the year 2050. We can exceed our budget without the energy sector or fossil fuels even factored into the equation, simply due to raising livestock. To summarize in simplistic fashion the connection between food choice and climate change, we have this. Climate change is very real, it's worsening, and the situation's urgent. Greenhouse gas emissions that we produce, anthropogenic, significantly affect climate change. Raising animals for us to eat is one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. And lastly, any food movement away from factory farms, but including grass-fed or pastured animal systems, will not solve the problem. In fact, it's going to make matters worse. More land use changes, more deforestation, a higher feed conversion ratio, more water used, and more production of methane. 60 to 70% more methane is produced conservatively per one grass-fed cow as compared to grain-fed. Being concerned about methane emissions, as we all should be, President Obama and the EPA earlier this year issued a final ruling to limit methane emissions from the gas and oil industry with no mention about livestock. But methane emissions from the gas and oil industry, such as fracking specifically, has been decreasing in the United States since 1990. There's the graph. Whereas methane and nitrous oxide emissions from livestock have increased globally by more than 54% during that same time period since 1990. Going one step further, methane from livestock production in the United States is the only greenhouse gas from the only major industry that Congress has now created an exemption for. Yeah, that's right. As of this year, the EPA is forbidden from collecting greenhouse gas emission data from livestock producers in the United States. Animal agriculture, though, is responsible for 44%, nearly half of all global methane production, more than any other industry. And despite all this, the general public is more concerned about gas and oil and fracking than confronting the meat and dairy items found on their plates. Well, how important, as an example, is food choice in climate change? Well, we're currently pumping in 54 gigatons of carbon equivalent greenhouse gases into our atmosphere each year. 54 gigatons. If we converted all global cropland that's currently growing crops to feed livestock, and at the same time converted all pasture land with grazing livestock, converted that to regenerative plant-based agroforestry type of systems, producing food for us to eat directly, we find ourselves at a net negative greenhouse gas scenario. Complete mitigation. All greenhouse gases currently being emitted by all sources today would be sequestered or could be sequestered into our soil. This is where optimism about climate change can be found. But the reality is that we just can't seem to get our leaders on track, despite the evidence. And again, climate change is just the first step. Then there's connecting that to food choice, and then connecting that to animal agriculture, and then finally, it's the connection to all other aspects of sustainability. It seems like a long way to go. So we have to get through this first step, though, which might seem challenging, especially with statements like this next one from one of our leaders. And, you know, I really didn't want to talk about politics. I'm not going to do it. All right, I have one more. I have one more. Just another quote. I'm sorry, I'm not going to say much about it. I'm just going to put the quote up, but I'm not really sure what this is supposed to mean. I don't know what this is supposed to mean, but I do know he's pointing at me, and I'm fired. And I really am not going to talk about politics. Okay, I have one more. I'm going to tell you who I'm voting for, and I'm just going to do it with a simple slide. It's not a Republican. It's not a Democrat. It's this guy. he knows what's going on. What do you think? Current studies show that on average, we waste 30% of all food produced in the world. So reducing this waste is certainly important in our battle against climate change and loss of natural resources, isn't it? However, we could reduce our food waste to zero and still be wasting massive amounts of resources and continuing on a path toward irreversible climate change if the food we are eating has anything to do with animal agriculture. Well, this is a summary of a few of the numbers we're discussing today associated with climate change, just to kind of keep it simple. Our target is to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees centigrade rise, but we're already at 1, quickly moving to 2. Carbon equivalent greenhouse gas emissions, the concentration in our atmosphere is at a historic high for human existence, now over 400 parts per million, but the goal for livable conditions is to keep this number under 350. We're emitting 54 gigatons of carbon equivalent greenhouse gases per year. We should be at 0, and livestock emit minimally 7.1 gigatons per year, and the number is expected to increase by between 50 and 200% in the next 30 years. And remember, our goal is to be 0. Per 1 unit of protein, beef produces 150 times more greenhouse gas emissions than beans, such as soy or lentils. So you say, well, let's just switch to chicken and pork. will they produce 20 to 25 times more greenhouse gas emissions as soy or lentils. And with their tremendous rate of growth and numbers being produced, chicken, pork, and fish in aquaculture settings are problematic at best. Given the predictions of nearly every climate scientist in the world, our business as usual approach to climate change isn't working. And we simply can't keep focusing on only gas and oil. Therefore, it's time for us to get outside the box, take the right action, and to do it now. So looking at solutions, prescriptions, this is what we have. The first approach is to reduce our dependence on fossil fuel, just like Al Gore and everyone else recommends. But renewable energy infrastructure, such as building solar and wind generators all over the world to reduce climate change, it's a good idea. But it's projected to take another at least $1 trillion per year for the next 34 years to develop. Well, we don't have 34 years. And we don't really have much more than 2 years. And we really don't have $34 trillion. So another solution to climate change would be we could stop eating animals today. It doesn't have to take 34 years. And instead of $34 trillion, it costs you nothing. That's the prescription to mitigate, not adapt to, but to mitigate climate change.